Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Laurence Hillman. So, welcome, Laurence.
Hi, thank you, John, and thanks for having me.
Laurence, we are going to talk today about, well, I hope we're going to talk about a little bit about the archetypal eye, the archetypes at work. I read something this morning from Jung. He said the archetype, no one ever invented the archetypes; they've always been there, and I hope we can go into a little bit about that. Which is your field of work. But before we started, I usually like to ask people a little bit about their story, the main influences, the turning points. So I wonder whether you could start with just a little bit of your story, how you got into this area as well.
Thank you. Yeah, well, um, I was raised with awareness of other worlds in many different ways. So it wasn't just what you could measure. I was fortunate to go to a Steiner school, what is called a Waldorf school typically now, and in Switzerland where I grew up. And I spent my summers in Sweden in the forests. And to me, the natural world was always very much alive. So my Steiner school teacher would, we learned all the fairy, all the Brother Grimm stories. We learned all the Greek mythology. We learned biblical stories. We learned all kinds of stories, and so the world was animated to me and was and was alive and ensouled in a way that today is kind of hard to find or even imagine. And then, of course, I was marinated, as a friend of mine once said, in depth psychology and in archetypal thinking from very early on through my father's work and his way of thinking and telling stories and looking at the world. And then a very big influence was also my mother, who really loved astrology a lot. And when I was 16, I was kind of a bored teenager and, didn't have it hard in school and didn't have other things to do. And my mother was always looking for things for me to do outside of school because she believed school had limited value as far as, learning about life. So she sent me to this family friend whom I'd known since I was a little boy, to go learn astrology with him. And I thought, whatever, I went down there and sat in front of him. I was 16 years old, and she said,
Was
"Hey,
this in Sweden?
in Zurich. This was all in
In
Zurich,
Zurich.
Switzerland,
Right.
where I grew up." And he
Mm.
was there then. He had lived in India many years. I'd known him as an uncle. He used to stay with us at times. He was living in town. And I went down there and sat in front of him. I was 16, and he said, "So you want to study astrology?" And I'm like, "I guess." I didn't know.
Yeah.
My mother sent me, that kind of a
One of
thing.
those fateful
One of
things which seems like nothing at the time.
Exactly. And 10 minutes into my first lesson, it was crystal clear to me, this is what I'm going to do all my life. I was
Yeah.
16. It was one of those moments. It was one of those wonderful moments that my father writes about in the Soul's Code, where it just speaks to you and this is it.
Mm.
My second thought was, and I'm going to do it full time when I turn 40. I have a lot of things to do before. And I ended up doing it full time when I turned 38. Before then, I did a lot of other things, always doing astrology since I was 16, which is now 48 years ago. So,
Mm.
long time. But that became the thread through my life. Important, very important teacher and way of thinking.
And who was the teacher, if you don't mind me
His
asking?
name was Friedrich John Hopman, Jan with a Jan. He was a Dutch man who was also an architect, interestingly enough, trained architect. Because I then went on and got a degree in architecture.
Yeah.
So there's similarities between architecture and astrology. One could talk about that, not just houses, but more than that,
Mm.
and structures and looking at patterns and things like that and spaces. But I called him Tontyn, Tontyn, which was his Indian chosen name. Like I said, he lived in Kashmir many years, and my parents met him in Kashmir in the early 1950s. Fascinating man. He lived to be 102 or 3 or something like that.
And is he a luminary in the astrological world, or is he someone that just had this vast
Well,
store of knowledge?
he was just a practitioner who did it for many, many years. And his teacher where he got a lot of his ideas from was from a guy called Thomas Ring, who was a German man who kind of bridged, sort of medieval classical astrology with modern psychological astrology, and I actually went to a conference where Thomas Ring was teaching in my very early 20s. And about a year before Thomas Ring died, he died when he was also very old. So he was really an old school guy. I have his four sort of main books that he taught, that he wrote that sort of describe astrology in that middle range between old and new. And so Thomas Ring influenced my teacher, and then I was influenced by my teacher. Then, of course, I studied with him for about 5 years, and then for many, many years after that, ever since then, keep educating myself in new ways with new teachers, new influencers. I was very influenced by Manly Hall as a spiritual teacher. One of the people who worked with Manly very closely, whose name was Clark Johnson.
Yeah.
He's a very fascinating man who lived here in St. Louis and became one of my friends, mentors, teachers for many years, an older man. And he then died in his 80s, but we were close for a long time, and he taught me a lot of things about metaphysics and just expanded my mind into other directions that I hadn't done as much learning in as in astrology.
Am I right in saying Manly Hall was, kind of like the Western esoteric tradition?
Yeah, he was a sort of a genius. He was born in the late 19th century, very late 19th century, and in the 1920s he decided to write a book about all the esoteric wisdom that existed in the world, like an encyclopedia,
Right.
and didn't have any money, and so he had the Freemasons out of LA, an organization that existed then, basically pay for this research. And he spent a couple of years and wrote this amazing book, which I was told once is still the most bought book after the Bible. Someone told that to me once. I'm not sure if that's true, but
Wow.
it's called Secret Teachings of All Ages. And it
Mm-hmm.
comes in big volumes and in little pocketbooks. So it has, if someone is interested in getting that book, I would get one that's at least, this big so that you get, coffee table size, so you get the images, because he hired some 33-degree Freemasons to do some images for them that are quite stunning. And it's a really good rundown, but it's tricky because it's so condensed. And it's literally like reading an encyclopedia of everything that anyone had known at the time of metaphysics, and it's fascinating. And so this Clark, my friend, came to our house here in St. Louis for 18 months, every Wednesday night, like clockwork. He was a colonel in the Air Force. He had been an opera singer. He worked in the CIA as an analyst for many
Can we
years.
just go back for a
Fascinating,
second? A colonel
fascinating
and an
man.
opera singer. I haven't
Yes.
ever heard of those two being put
That's why
together
I'm
before.
mentioning him. He was an amazing friend and mentor. But Clark came here every Wednesday,
Yeah.
6:30 sharp for 18 months, and helped us read the Secret Teachings of All Ages in a study group from page
Wow.
1 to page however many hundreds it is, with a lot of extra documentation and papers that he knew because he'd worked with Manly so closely. So it was an extraordinary experience.
You
And
know what I'm seeing a little bit of this. I'm just butting in for 1 second, Laurence, but
no, please.
I'm seeing this little thing. What is it? Intersection between the Jung world and some of the esoteric world on like Neoplatonism and that
Oh yeah.
line of Neoplatonism through the years, and it's incredibly interesting. Because in the Jung world, in archetypal psychology, um, in the Hillman world, quite a bit said about Ficino, but then the line that goes way back, um, a kind of Western spirituality, which we didn't always know
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
much about.
Right. And there's Plato, obviously. There is Aristotle's thinking. It goes way back. Ficino. It also goes into some of the more Carl Otto. Jung was very influenced by Carl Otto. There's other. I mean, everybody has teachers, and so I love your question. I've never been asked that before in an interview. How did you get to the thinking that you have? It's a beautiful way to make a segue, I think, to the past and to honor those who came before us. So yes, um, uh, absolutely.
The
So
ancestors.
yeah, the ancestors, exactly, to honor the ancestors.
Mm. And I just want to ask one final question about this before we perhaps move on. When you had that moment with that person, when you went for the astrology lesson, what was it about astrology? Okay, it's one thing to hear the call, but what was actually the call about?
It was a remembering for me. It was like, oh, I've done this before. And I know this stuff. I just have to refresh my memory, over the next 5 years and get it back. But it was a clear sense that this is what I need to do. When I realized what he could do, when I realized what he could do to feed my curiosity about people and how I could understand people in the deepest psychological level with this extraordinary tool. I'm very handy with my hands. I can build anything. So to me, it's a tool. It's not magic. It's just a really, really, really good tool.
Mm.
And the tool itself doesn't make for good handiwork. You still have to, know how to use the tool. So that takes some training and learning, but it's a great tool. And I absolutely love it. I fell in love with it immediately. Maybe remembered, I don't know. But certainly that it felt like this is a fabulous tool. I want to learn this really well.
Mm.
Maybe it was influenced that my mother liked it and loved astrology and talked a lot about astrology. I don't know. I know my father studied astrology with Jung's daughter. I have the notes from that, which was quite an extraordinary thing to find. And yeah, it's been around me, and Europe is much more, I think, connected to astrology than America was. Even when I came here, now things have changed, and astrology is everywhere. It's very popular. But 40 years ago, when I came to this country, to the US, I think astrology was still
You didn't?
pretty
Did
pretty
you ever live
weird.
in Dallas?
Never lived in Dallas, visited my dad there, a couple of times, but never lived there. No, I moved straight to St. Louis 40 years ago and have stayed here since.
Right. Okay. And yeah, I was saying to you just before we started, I feel like James Hillman is the elephant in the room a little, and I've been so influenced by the work of James Hillman along the way.
Mhm.
Can you tell me a little bit about, just before we get on to the archetypal eye, what the archetypal world of James Hillman, and how the archetypal world has developed for you? Can we go there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. To me, again, we're back to what I began with today, which is this notion of worlds that aren't measurable, that are just as real as those that we can measure. And, I use a lot of left brain, right brain kind of language because most people understand that. And I
Yeah.
realize the brain doesn't actually operate in two separate halves, but everything is intertwined, but it's a phrasing that people really understand.
Yeah.
So if you come at astrology with a left brain mind, you're going to have a lot of problems because then you're going to try to find waves that come down from the planets and influences and causality and these kinds of things. That's not how astrology works.
Right.
Um, so it's a right brain language, and that means you have to have your right brain activation and senses in place. Otherwise, it's just a matter of, computer can do it. This means that. If your Mercury is in Aquarius, then you think like this and those kinds of things. That's too simplistic.
Yeah.
But the art of it, it's an artistic language. It's a right brain language. So archetypes, the way my father and archetypal psychology talks about them, I think it's about the idea that we don't take things literally. That my father used to do a beautiful gesture for those who are hearing the audio. He would put his hand in front of his face and then sort of move it sideways, like he's moving all the muck off his glasses, kind of a thing. And he said, when you push all that aside, all that noise, then you get to the essence that's behind the statement, the behavior, what the person is talking about, the complaint, the sadness, whatever it is, you find something deeper. So that's finding the archetypal pattern. So the way I have come to think about it is a very simple metaphor. If I'm explaining archetypes, the way I see it today is that I think of a three-layered cake. The top layer is behavior, is what people do.
Yeah.
It's measurable. It's left brain. You can repeat it. You can measure it. You get angry, your face, your skin gets warm. Those kinds of things. You can measure the behavior and you can repeat it, and others can observe it, and it's objective.
Yeah.
Now we can ask the question, why does someone behave a certain way? So let's take an example. The first one might be, I'm always angry. Somebody says, I'm always angry. That's my behavior. It's measurable. I can see it. So we can ask why. Now that's a different question. That's the middle layer. And we can wear different lenses to ask that question. If we use a developmental psychological layer, we might say, well, I'm angry because when I was young, my mother hit me across the face every day, and that made me angry. Or someone bullied me at school or something like that, right? So that's a
Yeah.
psychological developmental explanation. We could also use a sociological one and say we live in angry times.
Mm.
And so, as you said before, everyone's obsessed with their politics. We live in angry times. That's a different explanation for the same phenomenon.
Yeah.
But those are different lenses, and you can use lots of different ones, whatever your particular perspective is. But I like to
Mm.
go beneath that into the bottom layer of the cake,
Yeah.
which is the layer of the archetypes. And the layer of the archetypes doesn't put a judgment on it, but observes and finds the archetype that corresponds to that behavior. So in my case, you would say my warrior is
Mm.
very active, or in astrological terms, which is again, in archetypal language, as we'll see in a little bit, maybe, my Mars is very active. I have a very active Mars. Now that's
Mm.
neutral. Now, what I do with that very active, see, now there's possibilities. Now we can say, okay, well, what do I do with that angry Mars? I scream at people all day long with that active Mars, not with that angry Mars. But I could also say, well, rather than screaming at people all day long, I could go work out at the gym or do that 20-mile run you told me, asked me about, those kinds of things. That's a
I,
different, that's a
different
different
way
way
of
of
saying it's
explaining
going back to essence. One thing I would say is that often, I don't know, I guess there's stereotyping, isn't there? And it can be seen as Mars anger in a negative light sometimes. But I remember reading somewhere, I think it was Thomas More said, just to write something takes Mars energy, to
Absolutely.
express yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we have these cultural stereotypes. We have other ones like boys don't have feelings and girls don't get angry and those kinds of things. So here's a great quote for Mars from one of my books. I have a collection of different statements, but here's one that right up the alley of what you just said. This is from Duke Ellington, trumpet player.
Right.
And he wrote, this is in my Mars chapter, so it's a Mars statement. It's like an act of murder. You play with intent to commit something. What a fabulous martial statement. It doesn't mean it has to be violence or anger. It's still that energy of Mars. Defending those who can't defend themselves, hitting a target, being focused with your energy, going for something, hitting a goal. All those things are Mars.
Being courageous.
Being courageous, standing up for something you believe in. All of that is Mars too. Limiting it to
Mm.
anger is incredibly limited. And
And
then
and
it gets very
it gets to this
cultural.
somehow the paradox of archetypes, or the double-sided nature of archetypes, or something, that their fullness,
Well, to me, archetypes are universal principles that everyone experiences, filtered through those layers I just described. So cultural is another way of looking at it. I have an angry culture, for instance. Let's say that's true.
Mm.
So somebody has an archetypal pattern in their
Mm.
chart, and then that's their nature. And then that gets nurtured in certain ways through culture and filtered up finally through behaviors.
Mm.
Through culture, through their family, through their upbringing, all of that. But the archetypal nature is what I'm interested in, because that's where their opportunities are to do things differently when there's a problem with how that was filtered and how you're expressing it today. So
Mm.
someone who has an anger problem can
Mm.
also deal with it using that Mars in a very good way, fighting for those who can't fight for themselves, for instance. What a great example.
Mm.
So there's ways to use, or there's ways to use energy productively, um, in the sense that it serves others and not just myself, and can be of use to the collective. And
Yeah.
that to me would be a criterion that it is worth expressing it differently if it's not about that, the way you're doing it.
In my jargon, it's kind of like Mars in service of the gods, or Mars in service of Aphrodite sometimes,
Exactly.
or
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And embracing the not so literal energies of these archetypes. They're universal principles. There's endless archetypes in the world. Jung used certain ones, there are certain different differentiations of how we classify them. But if you have, it's sort of like there's endless amount of sound there's endless increments of sound, but from what you can hear, right? But we pick 12 notes, 5 black ones and 7 white ones on the piano. With that, we can play any music in the Western style, any
Right.
song, any music. Yes, you can octave and so forth, but those are so astrology is very similar. There's endless archetypes, but we pick the 10 that are the planets that we can measure and that go around, that we can observe, and that have been observed for 5,000 years. And that gives us a palette with which we can then describe any event or behavior.
I think sometimes if I contrast it with perhaps, what is it? If psychology develops a lot on early childhood influence, if you want to put it that way, that you can be kind of become what stuck in it. Like, you know,
Yeah,
if your grandfather kicked you when you were 2 year old or something like that, and you know, how do you ever get past that? How do you get rid? You know, whereas
exactly. You can't change the past. Exactly.
you know, and then it's something about archetypes that are just so deeply energetic, so deeply essential, or whatever. But I also like the idea of a variety, a palette, as you said, because I think perhaps, well, in my world, it seems like it's easy to become a little bit fundamentalistic in one's view, whereas to see a variety of, like Venus, you know, we haven't spoken about Venus on the other side of Mars or whatever. So it's kind of like if one can get an appreciation of different energies, then is more room to express, to move, to live.
I think here you're talking about the essence of the richness of why I think archetypal thinking is becoming so popular. And that is that it is moving away from typologies. And typologies is just an elegant word of saying stereotypes. Because I know you've been to Jungian gatherings where somebody says, I'm an INTFJ. No, that's funny. I'm an, so we're so different. Or look, we're so the same because this is typologies. And there's 16 types. And if I'm not this, then I'm not if I'm this, then I'm
Yeah.
not the other
And an
15.
introvert is this and an extrovert's
Exactly,
that.
exactly.
Kind of.
And yes, there's some gradations, but basically that's the idea. Enneagram's the same thing. Sun sign astrology is the same thing. I'm an Aries, so I'm not a Libra. Those
Mm,
typologies
mm,
are extremely exclusionary by definition, because when I'm something, I'm not the other things. And so in the
yeah.
archetypal model, it's very different because you know from the beginning, everybody's born under a sky. And so in the archetypal astrological model, we all have the same sky within us. It looks a
We've
little
all got
different.
Mars in our chart, for example. It's
Exactly.
not just that
Everybody has
somebody
Mars in
like,
your chart. Exactly. Everybody has Venus in their chart. Everybody has the same 10 ingredients, but they're put together differently and they're interacting differently. And that's where it gets personal.
yeah.
But this idea that there's this inner multiplicity versus stereotypical simplicity and singularity is a very important shift, which takes us back from a monotheistic God to
To,
pluralism and to the gods.
yeah.
And that is a big, big shift in the consciousness and the awareness. And that's also hard for people in the beginning to understand because it's hard enough to have a sun sign. Oh, I also have a moon sign. Now I get confused, or I also, oh,
Well,
and
it
then
can seem, it has a certain ambivalence or paradox, and it can seem somewhat contradictory. Um, you
exactly,
know, how can someone have a strong Mars and a strong Venus or something? You know, how can you
exactly,
have both that are strong?
exactly. Now you're talking about astrology, and that is the beauty of it. And to me, after having done this work for 48 years, I have a really strong sense that the key learning for human beings is to learn how to integrate opposites, which is something Jung talked about,
The
and how
mysterious.
to do exactly what you talked about. How do I do that if I have a very strong, um, I'll give you a practical example.
Yeah.
So I actually look at charts like that. I look at the whole complex chart and I try to find what is the key creative story that's going on here that pulls this person into two different directions, and what are those directions, and how do you work with that? That's
Mm,
literally how I approach a chart.
mm,
And so a great example is somebody who has a whole bunch of planets that we would in classical Jungian thinking call introverted, and a whole bunch of planets that we in classical Jungian thinking we would call extroverted. So
right.
here's how here's how the person feels 24/7. They come out on a big stage of life. Their arms are out wide. They smile at the audience with a big smile and they say with a loud voice, "Hello, everybody. I'm this very, very private person." I have said exactly that line to people and they have burst out crying. because they said for 40 years that has been my number one inner tension, and nobody's ever put their finger on it like that and told me what it is. And now we have something to work with. Now we have an interesting story, right? But that's exactly how that feels to people. It's not true that people are introverts or extrovert. Everybody has both sides, but some of them have them very equally divided and very strong in both directions.
Mm.
And that complexity is hard to manage. That's where the work begins. The therapeutic work of, okay, how do you work with that and make that into something useful and creative? That's the work.
Mm.
But to understand, that's one tension. There's others, but that's just someone
Yeah.
that I've seen so often. It's easy to understand, especially to a Jungian audience, because they understand introverted and extroverted extra well, if you want. So yeah.
You know, I don't know quite how this fits, but sometimes when I've noticed with Robert De Niro that someone that can perform with a certain kind of an actor that can perform with such presence, charisma, and then yet if you see him interviewed, he's so intensely private and
Mhm.
quiet that the juxtaposition is hard to wrap your head around. That can often be that it's just in that performative mode that the other part just comes out so strongly.
Or it is exactly as I said, that he has a strong introversion and a strong extroversion, and they're both true at the same time. He doesn't have to be one or the other. We are
Yeah,
so used, we have to catch ourselves. And
right.
part of individuation or becoming, conscious about yourself and the world, to me, and who
Mm.
you really are and all those things, is about becoming aware of your own thinking. That's something my father always talked about. And what tree you're sitting in, as he used to say. It doesn't matter.
Is that
It
like
doesn't matter.
seeing through?
That's different. We'll get to that. But like, what tree are you sitting in, and not being aware that you're sitting in a certain tree that others have sat in for many, many hundreds or thousands of years. It's not that original, and it
Yeah.
has certain consequences when you think in certain ways. It's okay, but just to be aware of that.
Mm.
And so part of the awareness is that we are deeply stuck in a typological thinking. All French people are like this. Polish people are like that. That's typological thinking. It's simple, and it's called it's actually, there's a word for it from biology called taxonomy. I think it's taxonomy, basically categorizing things into groups hierarchically, and just putting things into little baskets. That's very common because it makes life understandable and simple. So,
Yeah.
you're a friend, you're an enemy, you're with me, you're against me, you're black, you're white, you're
It's
this, you're that.
also called binary thinking
Yeah.
in many cases.
Yes, it's binary thinking, but sometimes it's more than two types. Like, the Enneagram has seven, the Myers-Briggs has
Yeah.
16, the astrology has 12. It's the idea that if I can just put a quick label on your forehead,
Mm.
then I understand the complexity of your personality. And now I've typecast you. And ask
Mm.
an actor who was typecast when they were young how hard it is to change those roles. It's not
To
easy.
get out of that. Yeah.
Right. And so complexity thinking is something that we need for this modern time. And astrology is a language that I call it the poly the poly-poetic mind, which is a term I've coined. It doesn't really exist yet, but I like it. The
Yeah.
poly-poetic mind is one that basically says we are constantly creating this multiple mind that has these inner figures that come and speak to us and for us and from us at any given time. It's a very rich way to go through life because you can always ask,
You can
you're
hold
asking,
many aspects with that.
correct, and you're
And again, like I don't know. I think, I'm speaking in general terms here and I'm speaking from my own experience, but I think when you're young that there can be different sides that are somehow in attention. You can
Mhm.
have your wild youthful side or whatever, and your introverted reader or whatever, and you don't quite know. You swing between them, let's say. Whereas
Absolutely.
maybe as one gets older, one just learns how to hold. But then I'm interested also in the question of, when you were talking about Jung and his mysterium conjunctius, the marriage of opposites, there's something else. It's not just about being able to hold them. There's some kind of alchemical process that he's talking about there, isn't there?
Yes, and this is where this now gets very deeply into the work, that I do on a daily basis. But this is when you now have these opposites, what do you do with them once you have sort of the story? Every good play has a protagonist and an antagonist in it. That's what keeps us on the edge of our seat so we don't fall asleep. So
Yeah.
similarly, in the chart, I use the term agon, A-G-O-N, which is a Greek word that was given to playwrights that basically
Right.
says they were told, hey, put an agon in the play, it'll make it more interesting. So that idea, protagonist, antagonist, even the word agony and agonizing
Agony comes from
comes
that.
from that word. So once you find the agon in the chart, therefore
Mm,
in a person, you
mm,
now have the key theme that is every step of the way of their life they're dealing with, like the one I just gave you about the introvert, extrovert.
mm,
Now we have something to work with. But the
mm,
way you work with it, if you have a tug of war like that,
mm.
you can't resolve it from within the model that created it. That's Einstein, right? So we have to
Yeah.
step outside of that model. Jung talked about that.
Mm.
And, let's think they could just both keep pulling. Eventually, they're all in the dirt because they're not all going to be standing. We could throw it all in a blender and make some kind of an average. That's taking Prozac and you lose all senses, not my choice. Or you could,
Quite commonplace, by the way, though.
yes, or you could
Surprisingly so.
exactly, let's just not have any extreme feelings in any direction. Let's just calm it all down. Or we could throw it all away. We could pretend it's all not happening. That's also not possible. We could choose one over the other. That way we're running on half our cylinders. There's lots of different ways that people deal with it. But the only way to truly create that third thing that Jung talks about is by creating something new out of the two of them. So I talk about that very specifically in my practice with people. I give them exercises, I give ways to find a voice for that third thing. And that's possible, but that's the solution to the tension. And that's incredibly important because otherwise we're constantly stuck in this back and forth. I'm going
Mm.
to guess that out of the thousands of people that I read for in my life,
Yeah.
I might have seen a handful who had no tension in their chart at all. And between you and me, these are pretty boring people. So tension is a good thing. I like tension in a chart. It's what gets us up in the morning. It's that thing that has to be resolved. It's
I
a
remember,
great
I remember
energy.
back in the day in the corporate world, when in management development, there was that whole idea of eustress, which is like the good stress. But it's also in Jung in the pearl, um, the agitation. But
Right.
I think we sometimes underestimate how necessary it is to drive the growth, there's two ways of looking at the world. That the world should kind of be a bit more like the way we'd like it, or which often seems to fail in in the structural sense. But it's kind of like how much on the other side, how much this kind of irritation or agon, as you're calling it, or how much it can drive an expression, a
Right.
work.
And actually, what you're talking about right there is a form of looking at Mars in different ways.
Right.
Because Mars can be seen as stress or it can be seen as a motivator. And so it's perception. You talk about two ways of seeing the world. I think of three ways that we can go through life, sort of philosophically, and it ties right into what we've been talking about. The first way is life happens to me. That's very common in therapy. That's victim, things happened to me. I was a child, and so therefore I am the way I am. That
Mm.
is life happened to me. I'm a victim of my circumstances. I didn't have money. I didn't have this. I didn't have that. Um, I was hurt this way or that way. That's a victim mentality, quite common. The second way to go through life is to say, I make life happen, right?
Mm.
It's all up to me.
Can
That's
become a
very
little heroic at times,
that's
but
very heroic, and it's also very American. It's like take your gun and go west, young man, and take what's yours, and that whole sort of fantasy of manifest destiny and do your own thing and pull
I,
yourself
I,
up straps and all of that.
I'm being a bit naughty, but I sometimes think of Tony Robbins with that one too,
Oh yeah,
because
absolutely.
it's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
very
It's like it's all about you. It's how you talk to yourself and blah blah blah. And that's an ego approach to life. I make life happen. It's up to me. Nobody's going to give me anything. I'm going to do it.
mm,
Anyone can be president. Those kinds of things. Okay. The third way, which I hope to live by most of my life, not always, but I hope to live by most of my life, is that life is already happening. It's my job to co-create with that which is emerging around me. So that means two
right.
things. I need to, A, know what's happening around me. So I need to pay attention. And then I
Mm,
need to find out where my gifts and my talents can plug into that which is happening around me and co-create. that's a different approach. That's not about me or about me being a victim, but I'm here exactly at this time and place right now. I am that
Yeah,
acorn that talks about
yeah.
this moment so that I can unfold into that oak tree that is part of this world at this time.
It doesn't have that heroic, in my language, it doesn't have the
Yeah,
heroic feel
exactly.
about it, but the co-creation has something. So, I mean, that term's been around for a while, but it's such a beautiful term because it's the mutuality, the
Yeah,
divine,
exactly.
the
Yeah.
larger world of the sacred, you
It's
know?
listening, but then also getting off your butt and doing stuff. So it's not just about, kumbayaing with the universe, but it's also about paying attention. What does the universe need? It's not about doing what your passion is, but it's talking about how your passion can feed into the universe
Mm,
and how your passion is activated by that which the universe needs at this time.
yeah, that's good, Laurence. That's great. Well, I want to just go on to something. I mean, we talked about introvert, extrovert, right? And that was good, usually seen as opposites. What about this left brain, right brain? Have you gone into the work of Iain McGilchrist very much?
Yeah,
Or
big fan of his. I wrote my dissertation on this subject. I basically wrote my doctoral dissertation on how the moon, the astrological moon, can be read
mm,
as an access to male leaders' right brain capabilities. Because I'm
that's
a,
good.
my specialty is leadership development. And so I'm really curious about um, we can also talk about the left brain and the right brain as masculine and feminine. There's very, very dangerous words these days. They're very loaded. But in simple terms, I'm going to put it as forward going and reflecting. It's a different way of putting it. You know, the sun is light, the moon is the reflection of the light. So we have both. We have the sun on the left and the moon on the right, kind of a thing. And so this energy so basically, we made a decision culturally a while back, Age of Enlightenment, to basically prefer the left brain over everything right brainy. And so which was great, and we got clean water and good medicine and all kinds of lovely things and flew to the moon and whatnot. But what we missed is, soul went out the window. And so people are very stunted in their right brain capacities and are therefore also very easily influenced in their right brain capacities because the images that we process sort of in that reflective sort of place are given to them by their phones and by media and TikTok and these kinds of things. And it's harder to access the collective unconscious and go beyond that immediate memory to the larger ocean that we're all swimming in, where the images are present. And so they come to people in weird ways. They have awakenings, they have dreams, they have weird things that happen, quote unquote, to get access to that. It's not as normal as when, villages dreamt together in the Amazon or something.
I can think of a couple of things. Like, firstly, I always thought, being a little bit of a closet right brainer, that one can, in the society, one goes to university or whatever, and you try to become more left brain. Like when you're writing the essays, the beginning, the middle, the end, and you go away at get the reference things. And it's funny how you can lose a lot of what would be a good style from trying to become formal. But
Exactly.
perhaps for men, again, this is a bit dangerous generalization, but the idea that it's not quite acceptable to be a kind of a moon-based right brainer person who
Exactly. No,
grabs
it,
feelings or
that
something.
that's why I studied men in my dissertation, because that is not just a cliche, that is absolutely true. And measurable and provable, for those who are left brainers and want the data, that can be shown. And so so yeah, is it cultural? Is it what is, how did it happen? There's different conversations about that, but it's a fact that it is harder for men in general, for most men, as a very broad statement, to access their right brain capabilities, which is a cost to men and a huge
Mm,
cost for not sort of getting it and being stuck. But also the system keeps telling, girls shouldn't do STEM. Now suddenly, STEM, this math and science sort of studies. And of course that's all changing now, but I'm talking 10, 20 years ago,
yeah.
it was very clear. And so luckily the world, so my goal is to be a full brainer. Why would anyone want to walk around with only half their brain
Yeah,
in front, which is how most
yeah.
people operate
Or
consciously.
I don't know if this is accurate, but is it the hypothalamus or something? You should actually use it between the two
Yeah,
sides.
basically. Exactly. And Iain McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, is an absolutely brilliant, really, really foundational work in this. And I hope everybody who listens to this reads it. I'm a
Yeah.
big fan of his. He really gets it. There's lots of others who have written about left brain, right brain stuff. But essentially, today, especially with AI and with all kinds of other things, the AI that can already do a lot of really cool right brain things, unless you are hip to your own imagination and your own creativity and your own outside of the box thinking, you're toast. So it's going so fast. People's jobs are just going out the window really, really fast. And this is not a threat. This is an observation.
Mm.
And I think to survive as human beings, we need to, again, operate from a full brain. And people are desperately trying to do that with plant medicine, with going by the artist's way and these very, very popular ways for people to try to reactivate what has been lost in a completely scientific and rational world, which has a tremendous cost, unfortunately.
I think the Jung jargon would be to become conscious of the unconscious. And that if, maybe a metaphor is it's like when you walk through the supermarket and there's all the fast food section now, or the pre-packaged meals, that
Mhm.
through AI and the internet, we're just susceptible to the pre-packaged meal to such a huge degree. So to become conscious of this image making capacity or the imagination or the poetic basis of the mind in James Hillman language, or it's whatever, it's to become conscious. And then I would link that to when you said co-creation, link it to that, so that it's not just a heroic, I'm going to take on the left brain world kind of idea. It's not quite like that.
Right. And again, look, I have an engineering degree. I don't mind left brain at all. I'm a geek. I love programming and computers and digital world, and all of that is fun for me. But I hope to be able to say that I'm equally comfortable in the right brain world. And so to me, it's not either or. It's about constantly being aware that we need to up level both and learn both and find time to spend in both. And people do, they just do it in, some people, they get lost. Where do you get lost is another good right brain question. Some people get lost in music or in their creativity. The simplest way in my mind to know that you're in a right brain place is when you lose the sense of time. So people who say, wow, that was a cool 10 minutes, and they look at the clock and it was 4 hours, that's, you
Mm,
were in the right brain place. And that might be for some people when they're writing, when they're painting, when they're running, when they're doing yoga, when they're doing something that puts them in that blissful place
mm,
where their
yeah.
left brain is kind of shut off. And you
Mm,
go into this other place. You move all that rational thinking to the side so that you can have this deeper conversation with a different part of yourself. It's just as real as the other side. It's just not measurable, and therefore for some people it's a waste of time and is not real, but they're missing half their brain.
mm. And perhaps going way back, the calling aspect comes from something like that sometimes too, when you get lost in uh, the depth of the call, which is kind of like really coming from somewhere way back, you know. So,
That's lovely, really lovely, what you say there. I wrote a piece once about the calling being numinous, in that
mm,
sense that it is a numinous experience when you reconnect with your purpose. And, that's just such an important, it's like, oh yeah, now I remember why I'm here. That sense is a spiritual experience. It's numinous. It's not measurable, and it's not in this time. It's outside of time.
mm,
And so how we connect, real-time things like bills coming in on the 30th and that kind of a thing, and non-real-time things like our passions and emotions and feelings and things. That's the art of life right there. And it's not so easy. And a lot of people think, well, I would love to do my art, but I have to make a living waiting tables. That's fine. whatever you have to do both things, but we have to do both.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're not fully, I also don't admire somebody who's fully living in the, who's on a beach in Goa smoking pot all day. That's not a solution either, because
Yeah.
that's not really evolved in the left brain world. It's also important. That's where, a lot of damage is being done in the left brain world right now. And so we need to work on that as well. So it's a
The
full
word
brain.
that comes the word that comes to mind is permission. Permission to use both, permission to draw on both, because there's a lot of people in the management world, the corporate world, that are just so go, go, go that there's hardly. I can remember speaking to someone one day from that world, and they said the only time they ever had alone was on the airplane, flying between countries, and they loved
Yeah.
it, like because
Yeah.
there was like 10 or 12 hours or whatever it was, just by
Someone else is in
themselves.
control, right? Someone else is in charge of the journey. You don't have to make any decisions. Right. No, it's and I work in leadership development, so I work with leaders, and it's yeah, and it's a cultural problem, because especially in the States, which is particularly obsessed with quote unquote productivity like that, and just doesn't understand, days off and resting and the power of recovering and these kinds of things. So you have to fill every moment with activity to stay valuable, and people don't take their vacation days because they'll be looked at funny. And it's very different from Europe. Remember, I'm from there and I go there every summer, and people get 5, 6 weeks paid off, and that's what they expect. And in France, it's against the law to answer an email on the weekend. I just think that's incredibly cool. It literally is against the law. I was told by French professionals who got pretty pissed when I sent them an email on Saturday.
Right.
So yeah, so think about the difference in attitude towards work when you have that kind of those kinds of laws. It's unthinkable in the United States.
Well, if I ever get into politics, which I can't see happening in the short term, is that would be my first thing to implement.
Exactly.
Nothing on the weekend. That's great. Now, the archetypal I wanted to go on, if we could, to this present time, because I often ask people, about this present time, how we might navigate through this present time, and what you would say astrologically, perhaps. I think in what you've just said there's an important factor, though, that we often think of. Well, I'm speaking for myself, but of big gestures, of big changes, of big political changes too. But sometimes just getting that ability to be idle, to be, to have the balance and to have both parts is just on the local level, on my level, on the personal level, seems like such a huge thing to be able to do in the present time.
Yeah, it's a my father would probably have talked about a Protestant fantasy of productivity, of all those sayings, what is it, fallow hands or whatever else, idle hands, and
Yeah.
all those sayings that
Mm.
say that because it comes from a time where maybe you'll have uncool thoughts or unclean thoughts, or start doing things you're not supposed to do. So let's keep you busy, and if you don't work now, then when the winter comes, you'll be starving, and these kinds of things. There's a love.
The devil's playground. It's kind of
Exactly. Here's
the
another
unused
quote.
one.
This is so now we're getting into Saturn, the structured, but here's a quote from Aesop's Fables, the famous one. "Why not come and chat with me?" said the grasshopper, "instead of toiling and moiling in that way." And the ant says, "I'm helping to lay up food for the winter," said the ant, "and recommend you do the same." That's the difference, it's that's the living in the moment, and not caring, and then thinking ahead, and we have different forms, different ways of doing it, but I think balance in the end is always. I'm not advocating one or the other. I'm
Yeah,
advocating
both.
complexity, which means access to all in appropriate times.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah,
complexity capability, not having to say I am this, but saying I have my very good friend in town here. When I ask him how he is, and I do it every time I see him because I love his answer, he always says, "I'm in many ways." And I told me that,
mm,
yep, that's an archetypal answer.
mm,
He's not just in one way. I'm
mm,
in many ways. It's a lovely answer. And to actually know that you are in many ways, and that
mm.
if one part of you right now is
He's
sick and
he's
tired of
polyphrenic or something,
exactly
you know.
polyphrenic mind. And so, and if you're and if a part of you doesn't want to be here right now, then let it take a nap. You don't have to be all parts at all times. You don't have to, right now, I don't want to think. I want to dream. Okay, listen to some music and turn off your brain and just let things
Mm,
float around. Or, I need some structure. Okay, balance your checkbook, do something that's organized to give you
mm,
a sense of that you're activating that part of yourself. That's being aware of what your needs are at any given moment and activating that part of yourself, which
yeah.
you can do. Astrology is really good for that. And then there are longer periods of time, certain life moments, sometimes things that last a couple of months or a couple of years, that are also easily understood astrologically, that this is what you want to focus on. So, career or children or things like that, not just based on biology, but based on a lot of astrological factors. So that's useful. But to get to what I think you were asking,
Yeah.
which was, the archetypal eye to me is the ability to see through the literal and to see the archetypes behind them. I have a lecture that's called Venus in a Chocolate Mousse. And what I mean with that is that, when the waiter is kind enough to put a chocolate mousse in front of me, which I love, then I don't
Mm,
just see the mousse and the beauty of the creation of the chef, but I also see Venus, the archetype, in that beautiful, seductive, chocolatey,
yeah.
sensual thing.
Mm,
So that ability to see through the literal to the archetypes that are beneath it is the same thing as penetrating the cake from the behavior to the definition of
yeah.
it in kind of an ism down to the archetype, and just seeing the archetype there without any judgment. And then
And I
deciding,
think I would say that what I get from this anyway is that I think that it's the depth that often gives pleasure
yeah,
too.
yeah.
It's that, okay, it's one thing to like a chocolate mousse, but to kind of have that deep appreciation, deep pleasure, deep archetypal appreciation, it just adds another layer to it in your cake metaphor.
And you are communing with the gods in your language. And that's the beauty of it. That's why it's so active and so exciting, because you're recognizing the gods in yourself and in the universe and in the world around you. And
Mm,
that, again, goes back to the beginning of this conversation, which means we are now reanimating or putting anima or soul back into the world.
yeah,
And so the world isn't dead matter that we are consuming or cutting up or breaking apart or burning up or whatever we're doing. It is an animated, soulful reality that we can interact with and we can read and then co-create with. That's a different way of living. That's an
mm,
animated environment.
mm,
The way the Native Americans here, the native populations would embrace a tree and say, I'm sorry for cutting you down, but I need the wood. That's a different
yeah.
way than going in with a chainsaw and taking down 200 trees. And so that co-creation with that which is around you, we're back to that term.
With
So
the world that speaks as well, a
exactly.
world that can speak to one. Mm,
Right, exactly. And we can speak, people speak to their pets all the time, and not just literally, but they understand them, their feelings. We can do this with nature. So why can't
mm,
we do it with a tree or with a rock? Of course we can.
mm,
So it's just not commonly accepted, because we end up in the loony bin if we're not careful. So we have to make sure that we know who we're talking to about these kinds of things, so we don't looked at as weird. And
mm,
even weird is fine from my
yeah,
perspective. Problem with that word. I do want to say, I want to respond to your question, because it's a great question about the times that we live in.
yeah,
So astrology has a lot to say about, the times. In fact, astrology, in its simplest definition for me, is a clock that measures the quality of a moment, as opposed to the quantity, which I can see on the wall on the clock, but the quality of a moment. So to me, the planets at any given moment are always performing a play in the heavens. It's like a big performance of a play. And because I know what I know, I can tell if that play is a comedy or a tragedy. I'm reading the quality of the moment, what kind of time we're in, or a different
mm,
word would be to use the German word Zeitgeist, or spirit of the time.
mm,
You can read the Zeitgeist. And so then if we follow the idea of the acorn and the oak tree, then the moment of the beginning would also have a play associated with it, a moment, a quality. And we can read that by looking at the heavens above the person, and as above, so below, the key idea in astrology. And then we have the play that starts to unfold at that moment. It becomes whatever it becomes. So that's sort of the key ideas in astrology. But we can therefore look at the zeitgeist, or the moment, or the unfolding of this moment that is our current times, and understand it archetypally, and then not be so freaked out, because we've, as Nietzsche said, I paraphrase, we can take any what if we know why. Astrology will give you a why to any what if you know how to read it.
Yeah.
And so if you want to know why the world is so crazy right now,
Or we could say, in another piece of jargon, just sometimes one needs a bigger picture,
yeah, exactly.
a larger picture.
Exactly. And to give the big picture answer to the craziness of the times, there are lots of things going on that are culminating at the same time. The biggest one is the shift from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. And that is called the Great Year, the 72,000 years that the Earth sort of spins once in its wobble, as it's called. And that's a little bit hard to explain quickly, so I suggest people look that up. It's called the precession of the equinox. Precession of the equinox. Plato even knew about this and wrote about it. He called it the Great Year. There's speculation that he learned that from the Egyptians, who knows, but or from ancient wise people. But the precession of the equinox explains the ages. And so we're moving out of this age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. And it's not that someone hits a switch and now we're in a new age, but this is, as the song said in the 60s, this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And therefore, it might take a couple hundred years to make the shift from one to the other. But clearly some things that are emerging in this world are clearly Aquarian and do not belong into Pisces. And there's still a whole lot of Pisces going on. So as we are ending one era and starting a new era in this massive way in consciousness, there's a lot of breakdown, and not all of it leads to breakthrough. Some of it just leads to breakdown. But there's endings, there's death, there is structures that we believed in that are no longer serving us, and so forth. And also new stuff happening, at speeds that we as human beings can't even remember. The conversations around cloning and Dolly and all of that. It's like we didn't have the ethics to figure that out. Well, since then, so much more has happened. We don't have the brain to do it. If you tell an AI, to write you a poem about an apple in the style of Shakespeare, it'll do an extraordinary job. Can you copyright that? Who can? Can you? The whole idea of the whole
around.
Exactly. So the whole idea of copywriting, of owning, the whole idea of ownership, when we now have a global mind as we've never had before, just like the bees, in singularly, they're not very smart, but collectively they're absolutely super brilliant. So hive mind, global thinking, collective, connections that we're getting through the internet and now through AI, which is massively more complex than the internet in its capacity, is we don't have the tools for that yet. So that's the fear, and that's the freak out that so many people have. And then you have all kinds of other, you can make a whole laundry list of the problems that the left brain thinking has brought us: environment and politics and yada yada. But you can explain all of it through this, that the times are requiring us to deconstruct what we have built, because we can no longer be in that era, because time has moved on.
Yeah.
And so when people don't understand some of the key words of the age of Aquarius, like decentralization, global everything, these kinds of things, and want to go back to the 1950s and put women back in the kitchen, that's pretty dumb. Well, I call that.
Or in another way, yes. But in another way,
I
sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah, I want to finish. So the thought that what I call that is being tone deaf to the age of Aquarius. And when you're tone deaf to the age of Aquarius, you tell everybody to go back to the office to work because decentralization is out and we're all going to come back to the centralized office. These things are no longer signs of the times. They are outdated. And so people who are doing these things, you can look at it from leadership perspective, from all kinds of different perspectives, whatever you're in. If you go back to those old ideas that aren't Aquarian, you are tone deaf to the times, and you are either too big to fail or you will simply fail. And failing in business is quite common these days. There are malls here, shopping malls, that are completely empty, where there were 100 stores there a few years ago. Now they're empty, and there's pickleball courts in them and food courts. That's all that's left.
I was thinking about one that I've just been reading a little bit about lately, but in a sense, legacy media. You know, that there was an Australian in charge of the ABC who talked about podcasters like Joe Rogan as if he was, you know, had the mark of the devil and all of that, and that how it was preying on people and that. And but it just so happens that Joe Rogan is actually has, you know, whenever there's a program on at night on the ABC, the numbers and Joe Rogan's numbers, like he's already gone way past what's
Right. And
happening.
so
And
so to me, there's two conversations here. The first
yeah,
conversation is, do we agree with what Joe Rogan talks about or not, or who his audience is or anything else? And that to me
yeah,
is not the subject. What's
yeah,
interesting that the news has become decentralized, and everybody
mm.
and their brother can do a podcast or do a video blog or write what they want to talk about, write their manifesto and put it on the internet
It's
for $100.
decentralized.
It's decentralized. This is one of the key words. It's decentralized, it's automated, it's run by robots, a lot of the stuff, or by code. It's digitized. These are words that belong to the age of Aquarius. There's
Mm,
also a detachment that comes with that. There's a certain soullessness to some people with that, but it's
mm,
a new kind of form. It's a new kind of soul because we all have that Aquarian slash Uranus slash renegade slash, pardon my French, third finger energy in us. We all have that. When I give a lecture about how to be future fit, it is
mm,
about not saying, well, I don't belong in this new world. It's saying what they're actually saying is, I don't know how to activate my own inner renegade. Because as we found out in astrology, you have one. You have an inner renegade. It's called Uranus. Everyone has a Uranus in their chart.
right.
So activate your Uranus. That's the part of yourself that
Mm,
loves to be in this new world. And so if that part of you isn't happy to be in the new world, then that's the therapy you need to go and do and figure out why that part of you isn't happy. So were you told as a kid, if you stick out, they'll throw tomatoes, don't be different, don't dye your hair blue, you know, whatever the sayings were, go back into that part because that's the part you need more now than ever. And
I
some
remember
people are very happy with that.
in
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
scenario planning, they used to say, look towards the fringes, edges, and margins, you know, that it's kind
Yeah,
of aligned to what you're just saying there, because that's where some of the new emergent growth will
exactly.
actually be happening.
Exactly. And, you know, it was about 10, 15 years ago in leadership, you know, the big buzzword was VUCA, you know, volatility, uncertainty, I forget the other two. But basically, it's a term that comes from the military, and it was really popular in leadership development. Everyone's talking about a VUCA world and how to respond to VUCA and VUCA VUCA. It's an acronym. Well, you know, the other day I read this great term. Someone was talking about surfing the VUCA world. I love that term. You know, that's like, yeah, you know,
Mm. That's
let's
like thriving on chaos back in Tom
exactly,
Peterson's
exactly.
time. Yeah.
Exactly. Thriving on chaos. These are the kinds of things. It doesn't suit everybody, and
Mm,
it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but it
mm,
helps to know that you have access to this kind of world and
yeah.
thinking. A part of you knows how to do that, and you can activate that part of yourself. That
Right.
becomes the work if you want to be part of this. It's
Yeah.
like old people, you know, in my generation who are, you know, buying their first computer and saying, I'm going to learn this because I want to talk to the grandkids. You know, it's not my
Mm,
world, but I'm going to learn it. And suddenly they become whizzes at the computer.
mm,
That's the thing. You have to overcome that fear of what's new and of technology and all those things. The solution is not to go and live in the woods and disconnect from the world, because then you're not supporting the collective, because your input to the hive mind is just as important as that of those who are putting garbage in.
yeah. Okay.
And so we have a responsibility to the collective by participating in the conversation and by giving ideas and thoughts and deciding about the quality of what we put into the system.
Mm,
And so it matters if you get a text, if you just pass it on, you know, if you get a meme or something on the internet or in Facebook and you just pass it on blindly to others. It matters if you don't filter it. The number one, you know, that's how misinformation gets passed around so fast. The number one keyword in my mind that people need to learn over the next however long period is the word
yeah.
discernment. Discernment to me is the number one word.
And what
And
do you
that
mean by that?
means, what I mean with that is that the millions of pieces of information that we get bombarded with constantly, we need to discern what is worth keeping, passing on, integrating into our own thinking, and what is worth throwing away. That takes discernment, which is a very lacking capability, especially with AI. You know, AI is very seductive. I love AI, and I'm teaching a 10-week course on AI in the spring. And I think it's fabulous. And I'm also very aware that it's very seductive. So I did some research on something, and I asked AI, so hey, give me 6 people who have Saturn Sun conjunction, because I needed that for some research. Okay, so it gave me 6 people with a great explanation of this, that, and the other, and I went and looked up their charts just to verify. None of them had actually had Sun-Saturn conjunction. So, you know, it tells you great stories, and it approximates and makes up things. And so it's called ghosting, I think is the term. No, not ghosting, it's called hallucinations or something. There's some term for it already when AI makes up stuff. It's like it's an over-enthusiastic kid that wants to have its hand up all the time with answers. And that's great, but we have to have discernment in how to deal with that information. We have to use critical thinking. We have to use, you know, multiple sources, what any journalist has been doing forever. We need to do we need to question things. We need to know how to do good research. We need to know who to listen to. We need to judge our sources and these kinds of things. We need to listen to them, you know, we need to question the messenger.
James Hillman might get a shock if he just heard this, because he'd say, you're talking about Apollo. It sounds Apollonic in some senses. Meaning, I'm not disagreeing with it. I get it, but it's kind of like, but I think it maybe fits with the pantheon, you know, of
Well,
discernment
yeah,
is.
yeah. I think you're talking about two different things. I think the idea that we respond to what's happening in the world with a right brain approach would be sort of a left brain approach is an Apollonic approach. You know, but the information, the way we get it, is more than often an Apollonic bombardment of information. Yes, images come as well, and that's what I said earlier, that we're bombarded with images that we don't discern, or we don't, you know, that influence us as well. And so yes, people need to, I agree with you, and I agree that we need to add, and I would have agreed with my father if he had said something about, hey, this is too Apollonic. We need to also, we also need to have a Dionysian approach to it all and take it all in, you know, and so forth. And I think people are doing that in other ways. They're doing that with psilocybin and with plant medicine, and with ways that people are really trying to access other levels of awareness and parts of their bodies and of themselves that they've never really connected with. And I think that's all wonderful. That's the Dionysian antidote to
Yeah,
the Apollonic rationality. But I'm talking about that when we get all this information, which is mainly what comes in on the phone, because yes, there's
yeah.
a go with it, but there's these people's
I get it.
ideas, your left
Yeah.
brain, that we have to be more discerning.
In India, Lawrence, though, I think it's Vishnu, the four-armed, you know, and then in one arm there's a sword, and then the other there's a conch shell or whatever. It's kind of like you need the sword and the conch shell, you know. And if you want to put it loosely, masculine, feminine as well, I don't know, maybe you get in trouble, but it's kind of like not one or the other. Again, it's both.
Multiplicity. Yes, it's multiplicity. It's the same thing. Yeah, they
Mm,
get it. They have multiple gods. They never went to monotheism.
yeah. And you say, okay, so people are coming to, you know, I presume that people are coming to you. You're talking about this time sometimes in the larger context. What would be one other thing that you would come up for you a lot?
Pluto, the most powerful of all planets, to me, Pluto is a feminine planet, was misnamed. It's a feminine energy in that it's life-taking and life-giving, the most powerful force that we can ever come across, which is life and death. And that energy is, to me, a feminine energy. Liz Green, a fabulous astrologer, also a Jungian, also agrees with me. She also says that Pluto is a feminine energy. There's some others who say that. Lord of the Underworld, you know, more akin to than rather than Hades. I think of Pluto more like, I mean, yes, Hades is one incarnation of it, but you could also have look at Sekhmet in the Egyptian tradition, or Kali in the Hindu tradition. These are very powerful figures, and so Pluto, the most powerful of all planets in all of is moved into Aquarius last year, which is a huge shift and basically emphasizes all the Aquarian energy that's around anyway because of the dawning of the age of Aquarius, and is bringing out a lot of the technology that, you know, the explains things like the tech bros that are sort of running the world now and standing next to the president in the US. These kinds of things are very the power of tech and the power of taking over
Fast.
your identity and fast. And Pluto isn't exactly fast, but it's it's the term I use for Pluto moving through
Oh,
or over
okay.
something in your chart, I use the term that bullshit doesn't survive a Pluto transit is a term that I use. And what I mean with that is that a lot of the bullshit that we've already seen now about Aquarius, the detachment, the coldness, the mass, the power of the, you know, it's an interesting thing how power goes in Aquarius, because you have the power of the individual who, if she's smart, can sit in her basement, you know, in the backwoods somewhere and take down a whole government. And on the other hand, you can be spied on by the government as an individual. So if power goes in this strange way on these networks. But so the power, you know, issues about power, issues of the power of technology. There's a lot of pushback. There's talk about a whole new internet that is not controlled by you know, by medium. There is a lot of talk about aliens, which also belongs in Aquarius. There's a lot of talk about you know, the global mind, as I've talked about. So these kinds of things.
TikTok is taken down.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then it goes back up, and then it goes these kinds of things. It's all the end. Many people have predicted the end. I don't believe in any predictions, but people have predicted the end. It just tells you the zeitgeist. They predicted the end of these big social media things because they've been taken over by advertising and money making concerns. It's not about sharing ideas anymore, and these things. So there's a pushback against capitalism itself, against, you know, people are figuring out on the internet how to make money in completely new ways that weren't possible before, by doing what they love to do and having other people look at it and watch some ads in between and things. It's a fascinating new way that people are actually finding, younger people finding ways to not have to work for the man and do their passion. That wasn't really possible before the internet
Mm.
in that same way. So you find these new ways. But I think the Pluto in Aquarius is the second thing that's really big right now. We have the US Pluto return that happened also last year. There's just a lot of different things. It gets rather technical. There's a lot of people out there writing and talking about these things right now. But overall, there's a broad sort of takeaway from all of it without getting into the nitty-gritty
Yeah,
details. And the broad takeaway is that anybody who is predicting anything right now is an idiot in my mind. And I say that as an astrologer. I don't believe in predictions. But what we can do is we can understand the kind of time that we're in. And the one
yeah.
thing that I will say that might sound like a prediction is that, you know, expect the unexpected. If anybody thinks they know what's coming, they're wrong, because the whole purpose of Aquarius is that we don't know it yet. This is the sign of invention, creativity, new things, breakthroughs, you know, mind-boggling new things. I mean, AI was sort of a fantasy of science fiction 2 years ago. And then it suddenly hit the world about 18 months ago or so. And it's changed a lot of people's lives. If you've ever played with AI, it's mind-boggling. And so it's a very exciting time if you're not afraid of change, and if you're not
Change.
afraid of embracing the unknown. And you know, every single day of my life at this time, I challenge myself to break one rule that I've had,
Right.
something that's
Okay.
different. Don't have to do that anymore. Why do I still have to do that? Not important. In other words, I'm embracing the change by changing little things in my life every day to be comfortable with the change.
Could I say this, you know, a bit of backyard astrology without knowing anything about astrology? You might come across that from time to time. But when you talk about Pluto, I think of it in terms of the deepening isn't always pleasant either. It's just like, you know, there's such a beauty to the deepening. You know, there's something Venusian about the deepening, and it opens up the world to new intimacies and relationship with the world and all of that. But there's this tearing off of the old skin and um, what I'm trying to say is in short language that it takes a bit to handle the deepening of the present time too. Not only is there this incredible change, but that pull to depth.
Right. And part of it is beautiful what you just said. You're totally speaking my language there, because Pluto, that's why I said it's the most powerful planet, because it takes the most soul to activate your Pluto. It's the most soulful in that sense because it understands no pain, no gain. It understands that suffering makes you deeper and richer. It understands the wounded healer. All of those things belong to Pluto. Passion of transformation, transformative everything, tantra, death, power, sex, all the things that we're obsessed with but don't want to talk about officially, but are all thinking about all the time. Those things are Pluto. So it's the hidden, the most repressed, the most secretive, and the most powerful. And there is a connection to Venus, which is the story of Persephone, where
Right.
where the Venus archetype Persephone gets dragged into the underworld, and that marriage and that story for some people is the essence of who they are. And that depends on your chart, but that connection between Venus and Pluto is very, very ancient, and is deeply shown in that beautiful myth, and in all of us. It's the beauty of the being dragged into this stuff that we don't necessarily want. How many people have said, this horrible thing happened to me, but in hindsight, it was the silver lining that got me to where I am now, and all these things people have said.
And I just think COVID was maybe one of those, has often been mentioned as a time when it was kind of, well, there wasn't anywhere to go. Where could one go but down in a way? And but then what has burgeoned out of that? If you see everyone doing Zoom calls or podcasts and that, they say, "Oh, I started in COVID because so much of that happened."
Yeah, reflection. People had to slow down. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do, no hyperactivity, and suddenly people started to do some introspection, and some really broke down and had a hard time with it, and others just thrived because finally they didn't have the pressure of going out and making money. They could spend a couple of months sometimes, or even longer, just living in the moment and creating, and that was a huge awakening. Yes, it accelerated this everything I'm talking about today is in there. There's a poem again here. It's part of a poem from Emerson about Pluto. It is not only in the rose, goes on and on, but in the darkest, meanest things, there always, always something sings. That's the thing. That's
Yeah,
Pluto's
that's
gift to us.
beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So I love Pluto. It's my favorite planet. And
Yeah.
it's also the most feared and because we have the least control over it. You don't dance with Pluto. Pluto dances you, you know. So it is really a
And it's a
powerful.
bit of grunge dancing too half the time. So it's not kind of the dance you had in mind, maybe, of the.
Exactly. Yeah, you will be. I think of the dance of Pluto as a tango, but yes, where you are being led. And it is definitely a intense and passionate and unforgettable. So yes.
So what I get from all this as well is that, the Aquarius energy, the Pluto energy, as a characteristic of this time, um, as maybe what, in my language, as energetic patterns, as strong energetic forces around this time.
Mhm.
To
Mhm.
know to
Yeah, and again, I think of it as activation because I think the energy is always there, but it's sometimes more slumbering or less slumbering, and so certain things come forward. I literally think of our inner stage, our inner life, as a stage with actors, and the planets are the actors, and there are lead characters. I wrote a book called Planets in Play, how the planets are basically how we stage them, how they're staged in us. And so there are lead actors, those that we are most comfortable with, that are at the center of the play. And there are those that are more supporting actors, and there are those that are off stage. And this is also then the sort of the next level of that, taking those ideas of the acting and the stage and working with Richard and his brilliant model of mythodrama, which is embodying these actors into the physical, and using them for leadership development. We then created this new thing called Archetypes at Work, which has been around now for, gosh, 9 years. And we're
Yeah.
working in some very large companies, Fortune 500 companies, and very small, single person shops and anything in between.
Yeah.
And it's a way of leadership development based on these archetypal
Yeah.
ideas that are universal. And
Yeah.
it's popular, I think, because it's a universal language. It doesn't matter what culture it is, how old you are, how you look, or what gender you are. Things like that are totally irrelevant to archetypes, because we're down at that level, not here in between where we have all those
Yeah.
distinctions. And so it's an international language, a global language, and it's non-judgmental, and it's that everybody has the same. So we're not in a box. We're not typecast that I'm this and you're that, but we're all actually have this. But I can now go to someone in a different culture and say, hey, we work in the same company. How does your culture express this archetype? Let's talk about the warrior in your culture versus my culture. And now we have a
Yeah.
conversation actually interesting to both of us.
Which is diversity and variety of expression within the archetypal essence, and that the Maori warrior and the Australian Aboriginal warrior have differences in flavor, in style and
Exactly.
taste or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And but they both recognize the warrior, even though they have different, again, the differences come culturally here and then at the top in their actual expressions. But
Yeah.
everybody understands that they're talking about the warrior, not about the lover or about the dreamer or about that those
Yeah.
are different. And so we can find what we have in common in a time of great separation is, to me, a really important piece.
Well, that's great. Laurence, I'm going to put all of that up. Maybe that's a good place to finish. And I'm going to put the links to Archetypes of Work and all of that. I just have one. I know this, I don't want to ask a big question, but this is the last one. What about poor old Jupiter in all of this? I mean, we used to like the whole, like, okay, I can understand there's a bit of Mars conflict going on, and okay, it's Aquarian, and Pluto's dragging me down and beautifying things as it's doing it. But sometimes, but
Hold on one second. I want to just respond to that. It's very important how we talk to ourselves. Pluto is never dragging you down, but
right,
Pluto in your chart can be really active, maybe
yeah,
right now or maybe always. And your way of dealing with that right now is that it's dragging you down. And you could say, how could I use this intense Pluto energy different than it
yeah,
dragging me down? That is called
yeah,
free will.
yeah, yeah.
But to do that, that's
I put a
co-creation.
connotation on,
Right,
for
right.
sure.
But
Yeah,
that's the point. And we all talk like that. I do it too. But the point is it's a big difference, because now you have a choice. You
yeah,
can say, I have a very active Pluto. What do I want to do with that? As opposed to Pluto is dragging me down and then I'm a victim.
yeah.
That's
But
my point.
yes, but I would say in my own defense that I have a deep trust in the beautifying process of the
Mhm,
deepening as well. So,
mhm,
that
Yep.
alleviates some of that. But what about Jupiter, who I thought was this kind of lucky, expansive things? What's happening with Jupiter in the heavens?
Well, Jupiter moves rather fast, so it goes around the zodiac every 12 years, as opposed to Pluto, who takes 248 years for the same thing.
Mm,
So, it's it doesn't stay really that long in a place for me to be that important about zeitgeist. But basically, um, you're asking something deeper, I think, which is, in times of difficulty, what about the good planets, or what about the happy planets? I think all the planets have operate on a scale from very beneficial to very destructive.
right.
Too much Jupiter's expansion and growth. You know, Too much growth, you've got a person standing in every square foot of the earth. Too much growth, you've got a big wasteland. Too much growth, you've got cancer growth. Growth, the urban sprawl. Growth is not a good thing just because it's Jupiter. Jupiter is wonderful if you want to grow your bank account, or if you want to grow, something in the garden. So growth, again, the archetype itself just says it's about growth, but what that then actually means for you is not always a good thing. So what you make with that energy is what makes it useful. That's where discernment again would come in very handily. Jupiter is considered, our longing for exploration, our longing for journeys inwardly, as in studying things, learning things, going back to school, that kind of longing, and externally, as in I want to climb that mountaintop over there because it's there, and I want to have that adventure, and I want to get through that and bring people along with me. It's the teacher, it's the student, it's those kinds of things. It's learning and exploring. So yes, there's a place for that, and I don't value it more than other planets. I think they're all important, depends what I'm trying to do. And then I
Yeah.
pick the one that's appropriate for the action and I activate it.
Yeah. Okay.
But yes, I get it that those, and Venus is lovely and is about beauty and harmony and chocolate and seduction and gold and relationships and passion and all those things. Yes, it's also
And
about
mousse. You forgot the
and
mousse.
chocolate mousse. And it's also about backstabbing. It's also about backstabbing and intrigues and gossip and cheating and lying and all those things is also Venus. So there are no good or bad planets.
And
It's
it's also sometimes, when I think of Marilyn, I was chatting with someone the other day of the archetypal force, which is greater than oneself, which is hard to contain sometimes. It's like there's a human that became involved with a big archetypal force that is, that's something to deal with.
Yeah, some people are, I call that slightly something different. I call that people who are very clear embodiments of an archetype. So for instance, Mandela is a good example of someone who clearly embodies the sun or the sovereign, and has that radiance and that presence that doesn't have to say much. He takes on a room because of there's his whole history and all of those things. But if somebody had no idea who he was and walked into a room with him, they would have that sense about him.
Yeah.
That's someone who very well embodies that archetype. And again, it's not just how you look, it's an energetic thing. So some people embody the warrior, some people embody the lover, and it's not gendered. Anybody can embody any archetype. And so we have these sort of people who are good sort of examples of that archetype, but we can't put them in a box and say that they are that archetype, because then we're forgetting the other 9 that are there.
Yeah. Okay.
This is complexity capabilities to always hold the whole thing in mind.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I know we've gone a long way over, Laurence, but it's been a pleasure talking to you, and lots of great stuff in there and lots to think about. So I'd like to thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you, John, for asking these really wonderful questions and for taking the time, and mostly for your curiosity. That's a great gift. Thank you.
Thank you.